I have the great honor and pleasure of introducing our guest speaker for this evening, Mr. David Crombie. Mr. Crombie has a long history of public service and engagement. As Mayor of Toronto from 1972 to 1978, he was instrumental in the city's urban reform movement and oversaw the creation of the St. Lawrence neighborhood, the development of affordable housing, and the new downtown plan. As Mayor of Toronto, Mr. Crombie ushered in a new era of socially responsible urban development inspired by thinkers such as Jane Jacobs. Much of his time as mayor was spent trying to rein in the development industry. He was the first mayor to represent the reform movement in Toronto politics, and his policies differed sharply from those who preceded him. David Crombie then served as a member of Parliament from 1978 to 1988, during which time he held several cabinet positions. Throughout the years, Mr. Crombie served in various advisory capacities to Toronto City and provincial governments relating to urban issues, including a stint as CEO of the Canadian Urban Institute. In 2015, David Crombie was appointed as the chair of the Coordinated Land Use Planning Review Advisory Panel, coordinating a review of Ontario land use plans to manage growth, protect our agricultural lands and natural environment, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and support economic development in Ontario's greater Golden Horseshoe and Greenbelt. Mr. Crombie is an officer of the Order of Canada and a member of the Order of Ontario. Recently, in response to changes made to the Conservation Authorities Act, David Crombie resigned as the chair of the Ontario Greenbelt Council, whose mandate it is to provide advice to the Minister on land use planning matters related to the Greenbelt. Please join me in welcoming David Crombie, who will speak today about how changes to the Conservation Authorities Act may impact our environmental future and how conservation authorities may have to pivot to protect Ontario's watersheds. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Crombie.
Thank you very much, Andy, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Andy, thank you very much for the introduction. And I might say I want to thank all of you for participating in one of the great democratic rituals that I remember so well. So thank you. I am here tonight at the invitation to talk about the future of conservation authorities in Ontario. Their useful future lies, in my judgment, in the balance. When the province, first of all, launched Bill 229, which was a direct attack on the role and mandate of the conservation authorities, most people were shocked. Just as shocking in many ways was the kind of, let me call it the lamentable misunderstanding of watershed planning by the province and how it works. And just as shocking, a kind of sorry ignorance of the historic contribution of conservation authorities to the health, safety, growth, and prosperity of this province and its people. So let me, if you don't mind, I'll start with a very short, but I hope useful historic context in what we're talking about. Conservation authorities in Ontario are unique in North America. Many jurisdictions I've been at around North America wish they had one. They were born, conservation authorities in Ontario, in 1946. It's their 75th anniversary. They were brought in, interesting enough, at the same time as the Planning Act of Ontario. That's because they believed that land use planning and environmental planning were simply two sides of the same coin. They also believed that the new conservation authorities, which were gathered up from old conservation movements, that the new conservation authorities would be the stewards, would be the guardians of our natural heritage. And finally, when they started, they believed that conservation authorities would be successful so long as they paid attention to three fundamentals. One, that they would continue to embrace as fulsome as they could the watershed, the principles of watershed planning. Secondly, that they would continue to be fueled by citizen participation. And thirdly, that they would have appropriate financial support from the province. In the early years, in the late 40s, 50s, 60s, there was a time of, as you would all know, a massive growth and in urban expansion. So it was not an easy time for conservation authorities. It was like, as they used to say, having to be a good cop on a hard beat. And although there were some things like the 1954 hurricane and floods and so on that showed the value of conservation authorities, it wasn't until really the latter decades of the 20th century and into the 21st century that big changes came. Big changes came in basically three forms following one another. The emergence of new ideas. Secondly, the participation in community activism. And thirdly, leading to government policies and new legislation. Very quickly, let me look at the new ideas. Interesting enough, the new ideas, and there were many, many of them, the new ideas were in a sense flowed from some old truths that were being rediscovered. And I can put it in a nutshell. The old truths were that everything is connected to everything else. We are responsible for the consequences of our actions, and therefore the idea that you can move in, use up, throw away, and move on was no longer supportable. And also, more importantly, perhaps, that the major issues of ecology and economy and community are not mutually exclusive, but indeed they are mutually interdependent. Now, those ideas bubbled right across the province as it did around a good part, certainly a good part of the world. And therefore, it led to much activity at the local level. Everywhere, people popped up to have something to say about the new ideas coming their way. And so we saw things like remedial action plans in local areas of concern that need to be dealt with. Save the Oak Ridges moraine, save the Ganaraska again. All of those movements, and there are many, many right across the province, trying to give some kind of tangible evidence to the new ideas about them. And they worked very hard. And out of it came, thirdly, some legislation that is still with us and still commands our day. The Great Lake Water Quality Agreements in the 50s, 60s, all of those led to great changes in legislation dealing with the Great Lakes. In 1983, the Niagara Escarpment Commission was established. In 2002, the Oak Ridges Moraine Commission was established. Oak Ridges Moraine was established. 2005, the Green Plan. In 2006, the Growth Plan. And in 2015-16, the Integrated Plan Review, Planning for Health, Prosperity, and Growth, 2015 to 2041. Those still form the framework for land use and environmental planning in the province. Now, in all of those, the Conservation Authority, all those changes, all of those events, the conservation authorities played a major role at the center of it. They provided a day-to-day understanding of the reality on the ground for those who had ideas about what ought to happen. And at the same time, while the conservation authorities were forging new ways in which to give voice and give practicality to the new ideas, they carried out the services that conservation authorities have always carried out: watershed planning, conservation and regeneration of river valleys, flood control, water quality, stewardship of forests and woodlots, all of those things, including recreation and educational programs. Indeed, conservation authorities surely deserve the appreciation and respect of everybody in the province. But unfortunately, now they find themselves under the gun from the province of Ontario, the very entity that should be there protecting them. We saw that when they brought in Bill 229 just before Christmas in a rush. It was tucked into a money bill, so you didn't know there was an environmental matter coming your way. And it was passed into law just before Christmas. Again, in a nutshell, what that Bill 229 means is that it diminishes the role of the conservation authorities and undermines their ability to carry out their work as stewards of our natural heritage. That's why people are angry, because diminishing the role of conservation authorities and undermining their ability to carry out their work as stewards, I mean, it's unbelievable that people would think that that's a good idea. Following, or at the same time, roughly as Bill 229, we had Bill 197, which enhanced the role of what are now understood by most people as ministerial zoning orders. People didn't know much about ministerial zoning orders before. Why? Because they were very rarely used. 2, 3, maybe 4 a year, one time 6 out of 30 years. But interesting enough, the conservation, the provincial government has now used it almost 40 times in the last year. So what has happened, of course, is that these have become ways in which the power and responsibility of conservation authorities are assumed. There's unilateral jurisdiction assumed by the province and takes overrule what conservation authorities can do. And they can do that with no plan, no public debate, and no appeal. So that's why it's rarely used, but boy, has it become a powerful matter. In short, ministerial zoning orders have become weaponized. They've been weaponized by this government in such a way that they are clearly authoritarian, dictatorial, and profoundly undemocratic. Now, the good news is that there's a broad coalition of people, organizations, and communities across the province that are getting angrier and organizing to fight back. Their program of action is focused on the following. They are looking to combat the implementation of the anti-environment parts of Bill 229. They see the need to strengthen, not weaken, the role and functioning of our conservation authorities. Thirdly, they're insisting that there be citizen participation and open public discussion before decisions are made and not after. Fourthly, they want to halt the gross abuse of ministerial zoning orders and demand that there be an open public discussion of their use. Why, where, how, and when. And finally, they want to remind Queen's Park that that Queen's Park's job is to serve the interests of all of the people of the province and not just the interests of a favored few. So in conclusion, if I could, let me say what I think you believe. We need conservation authorities back at full strength for future generations, and especially, if I might say, in the new post-pandemic world that we're now entering. It's important to remember this in my final thought. Important to remember how we treat conservation authorities will tell us how we will treat the environment. If our conservation authorities are diminished, so are we. If they thrive and flourish, so will we. Thanks very much.
Thank you for your talk, Mr. Crombie. There's been a number of questions that have come through on our Q&A board and that people have provided us ahead of time. I'm not sure if we're going to have time for all of the questions. I do have a few that we can go through. And I also want to remind everyone that you can add them in the chat. If one has just come to your mind as Mr. Crombie's been talking, you can add them to the chat, or you can pop them in the QA function. But one of the first ones that we had is thoughts on the future. Where do you see things going?
Well, I'm not a soothsayer, so it's hard for me to know. I think the government does have the sense that they've not, even if they think they're right, they didn't do it well. But I think they're wrong, and I think they're beginning to discover that. So they are making some moves, but I don't. I think they require some further instruction from the public. That's why you're seeing more and more meetings like the one tonight, wherever they happen to be. They could be annual meetings, or they could be any other kind of meetings. There are more and more people trying to make sure they get in touch with the government caucus, they get in touch with all of the other two political parties, that they create a democratic wave of interest in making sure that conservation authorities and their role and function are maintained. So where's it going? It's still going to be dependent on the public saying, we don't like what you're doing, please change.
Excellent, thank you. I have one more specific one. And this question is, do you think that the changes to the CA role or CA powers will have cascading effects on other decision makers or agencies, land use policies, etc.?
No, I think they will have an effect. It may not be what the government intended, because I think people are beginning to now try and learn as much as they can about conservation authorities. Before, they enjoyed conservation authorities and they took them for granted. When they can't take it for granted, and they use them perhaps only for recreation reasons or education reasons, but they begin to understand the vital functions that conservation authorities play, then you're finding, I think, that the cascading influence or the cascading impact is one which is going to, I think, bring news to the government that they need to change their way on this.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I think your answer actually addressed one of a few of the other questions that we had. This is follows on what one of the previous questions or answers that you've been given is, how do members of the public and partners support the CAs going forward?
Well, it's a good question, because most of the public simply, if there's a program going on, will help donate, will pay their way in, and so on. So they do try and participate, and I think they want to be asked how they can participate. Some of them are different, but first of all, there's 36 of them across the province, and they all serve different communities, and those communities are not necessarily the same. They're not the same in downtown Toronto as they are in downtown Lindsay, or the Lakes. So most of the action for conservation authorities are local, and we need to make sure that they've got all the information they can get, so that there are organizations. I'm involved with a number of them. Conservation Ontario does some really nice work on that. There are Greenbelt organizations. There's CELA, this is Canadian Environmental Law Association, Environmental Defense. There are lots of organizations, both local and regional and provincial, that are there. And in the new world of Googling up, you can find them. The thing to do is to get involved. We need to have more, and politicians, I've been one for years. Politicians live in a vote economy. And if they find that the public is not going to be voting for them, unless there's some moral question involved, they will want to try and do what they can. And so, but if you don't hear from them, they don't hear from people, they don't know any better.
Wonderful, thank you. And I have one last question for you, if you could take the time for that. That came from our Q&A, and that was one of our attendees was asking, is there any teeth left in the Bill of Rights around requests for review, in your opinion?
In the Environmental Bill of Rights, I've had some conversations with civil liberties about that. It's a little unclear. And the reason it's a bit unclear is because it was not brought forward in an environmental bill. They snuck it into a budget bill, and that obscures the line, I think, for lawyers. But on the other hand, people are still working on it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Crombie. Thank you, panelists, attendees and panelists for such great questions. And thank you again, Mr. Crombie, for such thorough and thoughtful answers. I'm going to turn the floor back over to Chair Andy Mitchell right now.
Thank you, Jennifer, for moderating the questions. David, thank you very much for your presentation. You are a voice, and a passionate voice, and one that is of great value as it booms across this province. And the passion that you have for the protection of people, places, and our environment, it really comes through in what you say. And so
thanks,
thank
Andy.
you for taking.
I appreciate that, and congratulations to you on your post again.
Thank you very much. So in lieu of a speaking fee, donation, David has asked that a donation be made in his name to Camp Kawarth's Forest School Program. Camp Kawarth is a leader in the delivery of outdoor and environmental education programs, and in response to the COVID-19 pandemic have launched a forest school. Developed in Europe, forest schools are a model of education where most of the learning takes place outside. I know, David, they'll very much appreciate you directing a donation to them.
Oh, I know the program. It's a good one.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're going to move on with the rest of it. I know that you probably have other things to do, but again, thank you very, very much. And we really appreciate the time you took.
Thank you. You keep well.
Thank you. You too.